Hello again. I'm Anna Prosser, I'm your host. I'm here to just remind you we have only a few minutes until our next panel, which is going to be amazing. But before we get there, I wanted to chat with you a little bit while we wait about Extra Life. Many of you may be familiar. It's a fundraising program for Children's Miracle Network hospitals. It fundraises all year round to change kids' health, to change the future, which is definitely something we can all benefit from. All the donations go to member hospitals. They fund things like critical life-saving treatments and healthcare services, innovative research, vital pediatric medical equipment, and child life services. Where you come in is that Wizards of the Coast is proud to continue a partnership with Extra Life for their 4th Secret Lair drop. That's going to be available November 4th through 7th. So check out those cards and support Extra Life by going to the Secret Lair official website. You can pull up your phone, do it right now. We have a couple minutes. That's going to be secretlair.wizards.com. Really great way to have some fun and help some kids. Highly recommend it. For now, sit tight. We'll be back in just a few with our next panel. Now comes the moment you've all been waiting for. We have a very special hour coming up. It's always so exciting to get to tune into a conversation between the greats, and the greats are who we have. Today we're going to be welcoming from home on the East Coast, someone we owe so much. That is Richard Garfield. And to lead us in that conversation, please give a very warm welcome to your host, Mr. Brian David Marshall.
Hello, everybody. So excited to be here. I haven't done a lot of Magic coverage. I retired from it, but I could not resist an opportunity to come here and talk to someone who changed all of our lives and changed lives all over the world, had an idea. He had an idea, and that idea has just unfolded over the decades and has become what Magic is today. Let's talk to the man with the mismatched socks, Dr. Richard Garfield. Come on, let's get up. Let's stand up. Richard, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's actually kind of ghostly. The sound control is so good that it sounds like nothing's happening when people are clapping. I'm glad was able to see that there was somebody there.
Let me stop for a second. We were talking a little bit backstage, and I mentioned the mismatched socks. I'm wearing mismatched socks today. It's become a way that people can honor you and sort of say thank you for the work you've done to create this game. What is the origin of mismatched socks?
Well, at some point it was a utilitarian calculation. I wanted to spend less time on socks, and so I decided not matching them was a sensible thing. And it was, a huge backfire. I've spent more time on socks now than most people, anybody but a professional in the sock world, I suppose.
That's amazing. Now, go ahead. Let's talk about a different origin, though. Please, can you tell me what was the genesis, the lightning bolt moment, if you will, for the creation of Magic? What was, for people who might not know, I know some of us have heard it before, but 30 years, a lot of people have jumped on it at new points. So if you could just tell us a little bit about the origin of the game.
Sure. Most of my game design is really evolutionary. You try things and you tinker with them. And Magic is one of the few things which was a bolt from the blue. And the history was that I was not intending to be a professional game designer because it looked like a really unstable place to stake one's future, which in the 80s and 90s is probably true. I mean, it's still true today, but a lot less so. And so I had a friend who was representing Robo-Rally because while I did not want to be a professional game designer, I should say, while I wasn't aiming for that, I was doing game design very seriously as a hobby. And he pitched it to half a dozen companies. And then the first one that really looked solid was Wizards of the Coast, who had not published any games yet at that point. But it was too expensive for them. And he asked me for some other ideas, something cheaper. And while on vacation later that week, I suddenly had this realization. I was just thinking of just doing a plain card game because I figured that would be pretty cheap. This realization that you didn't all have to have the same components. And that blew me away with the possibilities that could bring. And when I told him about it, Peter Adkison, he was very excited too. And it turned out, of course, not to be cheaper than Robo-Rally to make, but it was exciting enough that it was worth really trying to raise the money. And it's a really good one exercise. I always revisit that moment, and it really clarifies some things about thinking around that time, at least my thinking, was that when I told him about it, and he was really excited about it, I told him that we have to control our excitement because I wasn't even sure it was possible to make a game like that. And the reason I would say something sort of so outrageous, since it's obviously possible now, not only is there Magic, but there's so many other customizable games which could be considered in the same family. And so what I was thinking though was chess where you chose your own pieces, or poker where you chose your own deck, like all these games which I was used to where you could, if you were given control over what you chose, they wouldn't be better. And so it took me a little while to get my head around what that meant and how to get around that.
How radical was the resource system, lands, at the time, and when does that come into the process for you?
It came in pretty early. When I first came up with this concept of the customizable card game, it wasn't Magic. It was sort of this vague, undetermined project, and I played around with some dungeon crawling ideas, There was a lock breaking idea, and but then I glommed onto this game that I'd been working on, a magical duel, um, and in it I had this concept for paying for your spells with energy drawn from lands. So that was already there, and there was a lot of stuff that was already in that game, which I realized was sort of well positioned to take this role of being a customizable card game. How radical was it? I'm not sure. I think that's the sort of thing which is sort of, again, in the sort of evolutionary area. Certainly for my game design it was. It was built over many years. And you know, when you start thinking back, there's very little new in the world. It's just learning how to find it in other places. So for example, the customizable, there was definitely something new brought to the table, and it took me a while to sort of look at just sports, right? Like I had some friends who played Stratomatic baseball. I didn't, but I was interested in it, and the fact that everybody had their own unique teams is, you know, kind of similar. And so yeah, once you know what you're looking for, you can often find it in roots going back further.
Now, what were your expectations? Once you have the game accepted by Wizards of the Coast, Peter said, yeah, we can do it, let's go ahead. What were the expectations you had for how the game would be received, and what kind of arc it would have? Because it's very hard to imagine releasing anything and thinking that 30 years from now, 10,000 people are going to be in a convention center listening to you talk about that.
Yeah, there's two answers to that. One is I had no particular expectations. I knew it was a solid game, and my evidence for that was that my playtesters were still hooked on it 2 years after the first playtests. And you know, people look at the expansions for a game like this and get the wrong impression for how important they are for its longevity, because my playtesters were playing the same set of decks, right? And you could play those today, right? You just, you know, get out some of those old cards and draft them off, and it'll be a lot of fun. The expansion is something additional. It's not needed. And so if you'd asked me back then, I would say, I know we've got a good game. I know that it's got something really special going on. It's really hard for my playtesters to stop talking about it. But I've seen lots of games that I think are excellent, and they, you know, haven't shaken the world. So that was what I expected. I expected there's a good chance that it's not going to get a big audience. Maybe, you know, maybe I wouldn't have been surprised if it got a small audience of really passionate people, and then I'd move on to another trading card game. Now, so that's probably the larger half of your answer. The other half, though, is are you surprised to see it at 30 years? And there it becomes a little more complicated, because I do always have had this idea of games being special because of their durability. Like I can still play Scrabble today, even though I think it was 50s that it was made. And you know, that's not going to be different in 100 years, right? Like good games have this, games that pass a certain threshold have this endurance, which is amazing for cultural products. I guess maybe similar to music, you know, some music has that sort of durability. So yeah, the instance of Magic, I was constantly surprised by how well it was doing. But then after a certain point, you know, once the second generation of people start playing it, well, you've got something which you can bet, if it's not mishandled, will last indefinitely.
That brings me right into my next question, actually, because when you talk about the endurance of a product, and I think there's like 3 stages of a successful product where you think it's a fad, then it becomes a trend, and then it becomes something that's evergreen. How do you manage something like a game like Magic? It's very easy for you to push it so hard at that kind of like, people are picking it up, people are going into a frenzy for it. How do you keep it from not drying up at that fad stage?
Well, that's a great question. I think certainly books could be written on that.
I mean, you might have written a book about it.
Just the experience with Magic as a book, and in general would be more. my experience of the course is through a little bit probably tunnel vision, but we very early on we became very scared about the treatment of it as a collectible, and were worried about the speculators. And this is something that was, it's hard to overstate how important this was in the first few years of Magic. How, like, the company, many parts of it were delighted by the fact that the boosters would go on sale and they'd be immediately marked up from whatever it was, $3 to $25. And then later on, they'd be selling for, it was like a month later, $100, and just ridiculous prices. And it was the people who I was working with in R&D who were sort of like trying hard to keep focused on this idea that this is a game first, and if you treat it as a collectible first, then you are not doing your game players any favors. And this conversation was one that we had a lot in those days, where the people who wanted to maintain the collectibility were arguing when we would make decisions which would undermine the collectibility in favor of gameplay. And my position in R&D and focus on that, just trying to really keep my eye on what was going on with the player, and Peter's willingness to just listen to me and people who thought the same way and follow that through, really, I think, helped shepherd this past that point. And to today, I'm very, I don't like to hear people refer to these as collectible card games, because I think that puts speculation first, and it should be gameplay first. So trading card game for me says that, customizable, similar.
Fantastic. Yeah, I have a friend, Alex Segura, who's a comic book writer, and when he talks to other comic book creators, he'll often ask them what makes up their comic book DNA. And I want to ask that more about game designers. Like, what are the components that made up Richard Garfield that allowed him to create a game like Magic? What are the big contributing factors that get you to the point where you have that moment where you think about Magic?
Well, I think it was my. I think the main thing was my omnivorous relationship with games. Early on, when I say early on, I mean something like 13, 15, somewhere in there. I was blown away by Dungeons and Dragons, and thought, if this sort of game, which just upset every expectation I had about games, existed, what else was there? And I took it upon myself to really explore games. And when I would get a game, my resources were such that it's not like I could try a game and if I didn't like it, move on to another game. It was like, if I get a game, it's a real investment. And of course, there's this huge investment in learning it. And sometimes I was like, this war game is a little, not really what I was after. I still put in the time and really tried to learn to like it. And I took that as a habit going forward, where I disciplined myself really to try as many games as I could and find out what made them appealing to the audience. And generally, in the process, they became appealing to me. And when they didn't, I still learned what it was and tried to incorporate it into play. And I think that was important with trading card games, because I think this perspective of breadth of audience is really important, and understanding that you're not designing for one type of person, but you're trying to design for a lot of different types of people and give a lot of different play experiences there. And one thing I described that as early was that I really like mechanics that people love and hate, and would rather do those than mechanics that everybody thinks is okay. And because people who are passionately anti-discard, as long as there's something in the game which draws them in, this is just adds so much character to the game to have this variation in what people like. love, what people love.
You've just described every person who hates Counterspell.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it took a long time, but I actually joined that crowd.
You've made the crowd like you even more somehow.
Yeah. There was a point when I realized, people, I guess it's just because eventually people got good enough that I hated it, right? But when people were bad at it, when people were sort of mediocre at the game, it wasn't that big a deal.
Now, you talked earlier about the idea that when you were starting out, game design wasn't really a clear-cut career path. It is now for a lot of people. But who were the people that influenced you as far as wanting to be a game designer? I mean, Gary Gygax, I assume, has some contribution to that. You know, you mentioned Dungeons and Dragons, but are there other game designers or people who wrote about games that kind of shaped how you approached it?
Games were in kind of a really kind of interesting state in the 70s and 80s. There were still a lot of games that I played which were just uncredited, either because they were traditional or because they were published by, Milton Bradley, who didn't put the credit there because they wanted the game to reflect the company, not the designer. But Sid Saxon, like I was just like I was omnivorous with games, I was also omnivorous with game writing, and that included not only reading about the history of games with Bell wrote a really good book on that, and strategy of games, and so I got read books on bridge strategy and Go strategy and chess strategy, and I was just sort of fascinated by all of it, the thinking that went around it. And as far as games and game design, Sid Saxon was one of the best. I think he's really one of the pivotal people in the Eurogame movement, despite not being Euro. When you read his sort of writing on games, he has a very, I feel like, similar sensibility to me. He wasn't really as concerned with what he had done as with what made good games, and he would just as happily incorporate other ideas he had found and pass those along as come up with a gem himself, and he came up with plenty. And Wayne Schmidberger, I think that's the last name, wrote New Rules for Classic Games, which was quite good. And Parlett wrote the history of card games. And there's a lot of really cool books that were inspiring at the time. Although very, few of them were actually game designers. Most of them had designed a game or, some games. But now, I'm inspired and influenced by many game designers.
So we talked a little bit about that lightning bolt moment, that the bolt from the blue. You used a term I love for talking about Magic, where you're inspired to create this game. You go to Peter, you agree to make it. It's one thing to have a great idea. It's another thing to surround yourself with some excellent people who can help actualize that idea, right? It's really, no one's able to do this by themselves. Who are some of the people in your mind that are essential, or especially in those early days, to the game's success?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is certainly my playtesters were outstanding, and I cultivated several groups, some of which worked with each other, some of them were in different areas, and they helped a lot, because you need smart, passionate playtesters to really develop a game well, and I had those, so they really had my list as to contributions to the early successive Magic. Now, things get a little different once it's actually printed because, and of course, Peter, heading the company at the time, it's hard to overstate his impact on it because, and a lot of it was listening to the right people, but just the fact that it's sort of an amazing person who's willing to do that, to go against whatever their instincts are on occasion and to recognize there are people who are better than you in various areas. And when I say better than you in various areas, I'm not talking about game design. I'm talking about he's got to get the printing done. He's got to get the art together. He's got to do the marketing. He's got to get people to understand this weird product, right? There's a lot of moving pieces here, and he has to find people who know best in all these different areas, and so he did a wonderful job at managing that. And then over the next few years, there's too many people really to start naming without feeling like you're certain you're leaving lots of people unmentioned. But going into it, the game design itself, playtesters are right up there. The product is so complicated that after that, there's just a lot going on, anybody I mention is starting to make me feel like, I'm leaving people behind.
That old group of playtesters, just quickly, do you still ever play games with them, talk to them? Is that a group that sort of maintains some sort of integrity beyond the early days of Magic?
Yes, to varying degrees.
Sure.
Many of the playtesters, either from my day or just the generation after that, are still working at Wizards, and many of them I do still play games with. One of them, Scaff Elias, he's been a partner in in a game company where we do game design and consultation, Three Donkeys, ever since the early aughts. But Bill Rose is sort of led Magic and for quite a while, and then started leading even more than that. And Charlie Catino's still there at Wizards, and then Mons Johnson
of the Goblins Raiders.
Goblin Raider fame. He's still there, and I still play games with him. So yeah.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Now, what are some key moments in your mind in the success path of Magic? Like, what are some of the key decisions? I mean, you talked a little bit early on about that idea of sort of emphasizing accessibility over collectibility, but what are some of the others? I mean, I know you talked about Scaff, and Scaff is someone who gets mentioned a lot as getting credit for pushing competitive Magic play. How important was it early on in Magic's timeline to demonstrate, that you would get, that Magic was a skill game that was going to make you eventually hate Counterspell?
I mean, I imagine there are a lot of routes you could have taken, but yeah, we chose to support this idea of competitive play, and Scaff was the most important person in that move. It resonated with my background. As I mentioned earlier, it was like I was not a competitive chess player. I played chess. I was not a competitive Go player. I played Go, and same with Bridge and all these other books. But I read strategy books on these things, and I was fascinated by this, and I knew that this was an important part of these games, like that. Their endurance was tied into the fact that people took it seriously. I know that people underestimate games that aren't played seriously. So you can take lots and lots of games that are played casually, and there's actually a lot going on with them if you choose to play them seriously. Take Yahtzee, for example. I mean, Yahtzee is mostly played casually, and you can just pull it out and you don't have to think too hard. But it's really hard to play a perfect Yahtzee game. There's a lot going on, even just playing solo. But then when you start taking into account playing, playing based on what other people are doing and trying to deciding where you want to press your luck. So that there's this huge difference between being a good game and people actually taking it seriously. And so deciding to really back that was a really important part for Magic, and one we pursued. I forget when it was, 95, 96. We were always sort of hinting in that area because we loved to play seriously. But then to give other players the opportunity, it was just very, very quickly changed the face of the game. Now, it's worth pointing out that there was a lot of controversy within the company on that, and while I think there's some merit to the controversy. The idea that because a lot of people like to play casually, they don't like to play seriously, and there's this idea that you make your game serious and you're going to drive away those players, and I think that was overstated by the people who felt that way, but at the same time, I think it was understated by the people who were advocates of it. And so what we would say was, look at the NBA, right? The NBA, a lot of the success of basketball depends on this strong, serious organization, but there's still lots of casual play. And that's true.
Right.
But
you still play horse in my backyard, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's not, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to start playing with some friends, play casually and have a great time with it, and then suddenly see them all start taking it too seriously and not have a play group. So, there's some truth on both, and what you really want is an environment where everybody sort of has what they're looking for, or as many people as you can. But having that serious pinnacle is a great backbone for your structure if you can use it, if you can get it.
One of the things I'm always fascinated about in the early days of Magic is the game came very close to not having the same card back from set to set, right? And one of the things that's just kind of amazing is that I can take a card that I buy out of a booster pack today and shuffle it into, a deck with some unlimited cards, and the card back is the same, and maybe there's some, some patina on my older cards that'll show through, but the cards look the same. What happened there, and where did you fall on that argument to sort of have this homogenized card back throughout the game's history?
Yeah, that's a really good story. It points, it certainly points to my fallibility as a visionary, although it also points to my willingness to adapt. When Magic first came out, my vision for it was that we would produce a certain number of cards, that would be the environment, and then a year later we would produce another set of cards. That was what Ice Age was. And that you would, each environment would be independent. And Peter really was pushing for something different than that. I think he believed in that, but at the same time he got, there were lots of people who wanted expansions and lots of people who were pushing hard for more cards and different cards. And really the game was being consumed in a way which was completely unanticipated by me. I thought a dedicated play group would buy, 5 decks each, right? And then that would be their world. And sort of I did a lot of the balancing based on the fact, okay, if we've got 20 people who are sort of all loosely connected and each of them bought 5 decks, this is what the environment looks like. And so that's what I was thinking about. I was not thinking about at all, if you can choose whatever card you like, what's going to happen. Because that just seemed ridiculous. So there were a lot of things that when the game started changed the calculus. Anyway, to get to your question, he pushed me to make an expansion. I made Arabian Nights, but it was not going to have the benefit of 2 years of playtest with dedicated playtesters. Any way you cut it, it was not going to be, I couldn't vouch for its own quality, let alone its quality mixed in with all the other cards. And so I wanted players not to feel obligated to play with or against these cards. And that's why I pushed for a different card back. Because I wanted them to see on the back, this is a different card back. It has a different standard. And if you like it, that's great. But if you want to say, I don't want to play against those, you could strip them out and it would be a very natural way to play. And it was at the very last minute that I reversed myself. And Peter would have gone along with me. And I was getting just like lots of passionate people who were against that. I can't remember anybody saying they were for it. There were probably some people who didn't care. And I was used to that in some ways. With Magic, one of the things which I had to contend with constantly in its development was my playtest groups. One of them would say, if you do this, Magic's doomed. And the other would say, if you don't do this, Magic's doomed. That would happen all the time. That's almost like the defining difference between the physics department, physics math department group and the bridge group. Scap was in the former and Bill Rose was in the latter. So I was used to people being passionately saying, this is going to ruin the game. But you know, in the end, you can see I went with the advice, and I'm glad I did, I guess.
You talked a little bit about this idea of what you expected a person's card collection to be like, right? You know, and this was certainly when I started playing around Unlimited, right? We set a limit. We were like, oh, we're going to buy 12 booster packs or this many starter decks, and that's going to be the card pool. We're never going to buy more cards, right? This is it. It didn't work out that way. So you really never anticipated a world where these 60 card decks would be like 15 slots, where they become very homogenized and four of and four of and four of. That's not a vision that you had necessarily for the game.
Oh, not at all. I mean, it was certainly underneath a broad umbrella, I imagine, in that I thought people would make their own rules for deck construction. I was still thinking more casually in the sense that you know, most of the hobby games that I played had house rules, and so we had powers in this game we didn't play with or we modified, that sort of thing. And so I expected people who, Lightning Bolt, for example. It's a common card, and so even though I didn't expect people to be able to pick and choose as many as they like of any particular card, I did anticipate people coming together with a deck with 20 lands and 40 lightning bolts. That's not a big reach. It's not too expensive, and I expected people to play that, and they would win a bunch of games, and people say, "I'm bored with that. Let's play against something else."
I will tell you, I heard someone squee with joy at the thought of 40 lightning bolts and 20 mountains somewhere over there in the darkness.
Yeah, it took me a while. Like, this idea of limiting yourself to 4 was definitely not part. That was something which was player driven. There were some groups that only played with one artifact.
Well, they were mono artifacts, right?
Yeah, and then other people played Highlander. You could only have one, and there wasn't any particular standard. My vision for it was that those things might exist, but players would drive the limitations, and that the game should be designed for this freedom. And it wasn't until Netrunner, my third trading card game, that I gave up on that idea of designing for complete flexibility. And part of the reason is because it's like building decks is hard enough without knowing whether you should play with 6 of this card or 4 of that card. It's so hard. And so having these boundaries just helps a lot. And so yeah, I think it was a good thing.
You mentioned Highlander as a format. Commander is probably the most popular way to play Magic today. And to me, when I think about that format, it feels very much like what I thought Magic would be when I first read about it, when I first met you, and you talked about some of your vision for Magic, this idea of this, one copy of every card, these cards that are much more personal, these decks that are much more expressive designs. It's not just about building, taking 15 of the most powerful cards and 4. Do you think that creativity and expressiveness is what has made that format so popular? And like, I don't even know how much awareness you have around the Commander format these days.
Certainly, I'm not current on it, but I know of it. I have played it, but it's been around in one form or another for a long time, and I do know how popular it is. I think, I think players. I'm a real advocate for players taking ownership of their game, and this is an example of something that was driven by the players, not by Wizards. That's not a ding against Wizards. Wizards has embraced it, but when players there are things they are looking for in deck construction that just are not reflected in Type 2 constructed, whatever it is called these days. And that constructed environment may be very compelling, and it is very compelling for some players, but there's a lot of players out there and they're looking for different things. And so that is an answer to it.
One of the things that's come up on panel after panel this weekend is people talk about the community around Magic, the friendships that are formed around Magic. The last 30 years, most of the friends that I've made have been through Magic. And there's always this moment, whether it's comics or games or a record store, where you walk through a doorway for the first time into that comic or game store or yarn store, whatever it is your hobby is, and you find other people who love what you love. And it's, magical, not to overuse that word this weekend, but what was that moment for you? Where was the moment where, young Richard Garfield walks through a door and says, "Oh crap, I'm home. These are my people." Where does that happen for you?
Probably Essen, 1994. It's the thing is that
for those who don't know, Essen is a gigantic gaming convention in Europe, and it is like, if you've ever loved a Euro game, that is the place where people converge around that type of gameplay.
Yeah, and so the reason my mind goes there is because I of course was not raised on a game like Magic, and it in some ways it's very different in many ways than the games I grew up with, and I've said before, I really cultivated an omnivorousness in games and a love of games as a whole. And so my first feeling of that was really going, when I was in Essen there, it was like I was blown away by all these people who loved games in all their shapes and forms. And there were just so many different things going on there and ideas. It was inspiring. And these days I see that much more, not just Essen, but just online. There's so many people passionate about so many different types of games, and for Magic in particular, it has made a home for me in many different places. I always feel it's like I've traveled the world and talked to Magic players, and always feel welcome joining into their games and their drafts and talking about it with them. There is a sort of a feeling of family and homeness there as well, but I still try to hold the passport for games in general, as opposed to the land of Magic in particular.
Right. I certainly hope that somebody here in this cavernous hall filled with Magic players is having that kind of experience that you had at Essen for the first time, and is going to make some lifelong friendships, and realize that what a special place, you know, Magic and gaming can be. So, you know, and that doesn't happen without you, again, having that initial idea, creating this game. But in the 30 years, and more than 30 years since then, you know, Magic's become so much more than a game, right? It's become a franchise, right? It's comics, it's going to be an animated series. I'm sure we're all waiting for the Planeswalker cinematic universe to finally get here at some point, right? What is that like for you? As you know, there's not that many people that get to have that experience in life. I mean, I imagine Stan Lee experiences that, George Lucas experiences that, Gary Gygax, you know, to some extent. But you're on a very short list of people who get to say, I had an idea, and now there's this universe that has sprawled out of that, come to life, taken on its own, you know, essence. What is that experience like for people, for you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's certainly. I always feel sort of overwhelmed and gratified to have brought a lot of people into games and shared this game design with them. The world around it it's not overwhelming in the same ways because I'm so sort of passionately aligned with games, but it is exciting and interesting. It's probably, I think if I was a writer and this had been happening, I would have had that same level of excitement for the world. As it is, it's more interesting but sidelined to what's going on with Magic the game and the world of games. So yeah, I hope there aren't people disappointed by that, but I think that's the truth.
It is fascinating to me. I think this is very unique, right? To someone who comes from such a math background and such a, you know, game theory background to then have essentially created this whole narrative universe. It's not the path you would expect. I'm going to ask you one last question, then I'm going to let some people from the audience come up and ask you some questions if people want to queue up to the mic. Where does Magic go in the next 30 years? What do you think Magic looks like 30 years from now when we're both back here doing this interview again?
I don't know. I would not hazard a guess, but I'm hoping certainly that it has the same breadth of game design, game appeal. That is that people feel like they can express themselves in many different ways with whatever tools Magic gives them, and that they have fun playing with those tools. So I hope that it has both a serious component where people really enjoy analyzing and a playful component where people really enjoy playing. I think that Wizards has done an excellent job as stewards and developers in getting it to this point, because I think that describes what we've seen, and that's what I hope we see going forward as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. We have some people, lines going over the horizon right now to ask you questions. So why don't you step right up to the microphone so I can hear you and address your question to Richard.
Hi, my name is David, and so I'm wondering, obviously you've gone on to design lots of other great games since you originally created Magic. And I was wondering, would you say, like, one or some of the biggest things you learned from your experience with Magic that you've taken to some of these other games?
So I don't know if you can hear the question, Richard, or not.
I could hear that just fine.
Great.
Thank you. I think Magic really trained me to see the breadth of possible players. So so there's often times where I'm faced in game design this question of whether I appeal to this player or that player, and Magic really trained me. In Magic, it's sort of it's a not necessarily an easy skill, but it's one that's natural, because you can make cards to appeal to both, and one card that appeals to the person who wants to play one way can be in the game, and it doesn't have to be there for the other person. The other person doesn't have to use it, as long as you've got cards which interest them. I think that sensibility really carries itself well into other games where it's not as natural, because you come up with a mechanic and one type of player likes it and the other doesn't. So really taking the time to figure out how to make those mechanics so that it satisfies both. There's another mechanic there that makes it, makes it so that both players have the right buttons pushed. I would guess that's the influence.
All right. Thanks, David. I hope that answers the question for you. Come on up. Just come up right up to the microphone, though, so we can hear you.
Hi. So you mentioned that the concept of lands and mana was one of the earliest things on. I was wondering how you came up with the 5 colors. How did you align at 5 colors instead of 4 or 6? How did that come about?
Well, so 5 colors was in this game that I'd been tinkering with a while. Me and some friends and I had started making these card games, which we called the 5 Magics. And I think it was actually inspired by a book which I never read, Master of the 5 Magics. They read it and started talking about it. So that number 5 ultimately comes from there. Now, since I've been very pleased with that number, and probably would have changed it if it had been the Master of 6 Magics, maybe, or the Master of 4. I think 5 has some really cool structure to it. So one thing I liked about it immediately was that with 5, you had this really delicious relationship between allied mechanics and opposed mechanics. Each color could have 2 allies and 2 enemies. And that way, flavor-wise, you could set them up to be synergistic in 2 ways and antagonistic in 2 ways. And it's much more interesting than if you had 4. You start drawing the diagram there, it's just less interesting. And when you start getting up above 4, 5, I mean, there's some natural problems with the more you have, the harder it is to get people to play. So 5 really is a very nice number for Magic, and but there's some chance it was just an evolutionary glitch that happened to work out that way, and some chance I would have chosen it.
I just always assumed you liked prime numbers.
Prime numbers, I think indirectly comes into that, yes.
All right, thank you. I hope that answered your question. Come on up.
Hi, Richard. I believe you enjoy the most creating new games, and this is why you chose to not remain a designer of Magic for many years. So you have created multiple games, and I'm wondering, putting commercial success aside, how does Magic rank on how personally proud you are of it compared to your other creations? Why? And what would it take for you to be enticed enough to lead, and not just consult, the design of a new Magic set? Thank you.
Ooh.
That is accurate that I like designing new games, and that is why I stepped out of Magic quite early. Although I did always enjoy designing for Magic and have re-entered the fray several times, many times when I was at Wizards, and since then several times as well. Putting commercial success aside, I'm afraid it's really hard not to keep Magic at the top of the list. Its impact and flexibility, it's completely aside. It's hard to disentangle commercial success from cultural success, and culture both broadly and also the culture of games, and seeing the impact. There's nothing more rewarding for me as a game designer than seeing your designs inspire other people either to play games or to design games. And Magic's unparalleled in that. So there's so many different ways you can slice it. Magic's always going to end up at the top. If you took Magic out of the running because of its weird position, then probably I'm most proud of Keyforge. It was a unique deck game, and so I think it was doing something that was completely new. It had some level of success, and not Magic, not yet. But I really felt excited doing something new and addressing some of the ideas that I had in Magic in a new way. And so then the third part of your question, which is what would bring me back, it's hard to believe that I would lead a set just because, time really, and also responsibility. The people who are in professionally, there's a lot they have to take responsibility for, and this would be a difficult relationship to manage. Not antagonistic, it would just take a lot of time for me to do it responsibly and for them to feed me responsibly. Participating in a meaningful way, that's always been fun. I always enjoy doing that, and that could easily happen again.
All right.
So I love Magic. In all sincerity, Magic's, I think, at a point where they're constantly scaling cards up from the previous sets to spark interest in the new cards. Do you see a cliff in the distance that they'll climb up and eventually fall off? In other words, it's becoming less like chess and more who has the bigger stick.
Well, that has been an issue from the start, and it is a danger. Wizards, I think, does in general a very good job at managing that. They're very, they're very cognizant of that as an issue, and that doesn't mean that mistakes aren't made. And so I can't right now say if your perception of it is an accurate reflection of a mistake being made or, something else. But I can say that if there's a mistake made, that Wizards does, there's like the cliff you refer to has happened many times. Wizards has gone too far in one direction and had to scale back. And then you get an unpopular set because it's not as powerful, or you get, sometimes they're rewarded because the cliff they've walked off of is a complexity cliff. And they go back to simple cards and people say, yes, back to simple cards. And so it sort of works, the cliff works both ways, but they've shown their willingness to change based on the problems. And so I have no doubt that will happen again in the future, and maybe that's happening, maybe that's due now, I don't know. I will say, one sort of interesting parallel to that, very early on in Magic development, there was this proposal that developers be rewarded based on how many banned cards there were. So we were talking about how to do bonuses, how to get metrics based on various groups' performance. This is an important topic. And how do you measure how good a developer was and how good a designer was? And I advocated that the answer was not that banned cards were bad, that actually that if there were no banned cards, if there were no changes, then they weren't being adventurous enough, and that the game was too complicated and too sort of broad to, like if there weren't mistakes being made, they weren't taking their chances, and therefore the game was less good than it could be. And so I think making mistakes is a part of this project, and then fixing them later is another part.
Great question, thank you. I think we might only have time for one more question here. So unless it's a yes or no, and then maybe we could do another, but go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Ali Alvis. I am a historian of the material culture of the book. And so a lot of what I study is the depiction of books in Magic the Gathering. So I wanted to ask you how you conceptualized the book in Magic, because there's the library, there's the design of the card backs, both in a meta way and a visual way. Like when did you think, I'm going to make this game bookish?
I'm not. That's an interesting question, in part because I don't know that I've been asked it before. Probably not. The image of a book was the idea, first of all, of the deck being a library. That was certainly, I think, my idea, and I liked that as a metaphor, that you had a library, not a deck. And then the cards in some ways represented books, and then so drawing cards were more book oriented, which is why you have the Library of Alexandria and things like that having to draw cards. The image of the book and most image related things, probably more Jesper Meerforce, our first art director, I think probably thought of that and implemented it, and it just resonated with that approach.
Thank you.
That was a wonderful question. I'm going to find you later because I want to know more about I love books, so I'm going to want to talk to you. I think we can do one more quick question.
Hi there. I was wondering about how Magic has evolved a lot over the years, and as the design has been handed off to the Wizards team, I know that you've come back to kind of join design teams. In particular, one of my favorite planes, Innistrad. And so I just was curious about what was the experience like coming back to join a design team and develop a new top-down flavor set like Innistrad that we've all come to love.
I always enjoy going back. And it's a good point, a good opportunity also to shout out Mark Rosewater, who has always prepared me well and made me feel welcome. And I always feel like when I go back, the stage he's set is really good for my participation. And it took me a long time to sort of realize that his and I know that he sort of gets some of the blame for things that go wrong, and he gets the credit for things that go right, but it's hard to overstate his impact over the years. And one of the things that I like best about his position with Magic was that he represented sort of an understanding of the playfulness of it. So I had so many people around me who were very interested in the competitiveness of it, and he always saw the game as much broader than that. And that's one of the reasons that he is so good to work with when I go back on sets, because he's not designing for one person, he's designing for everybody, and that speaks to me, and that's what I try to do when I go back.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, everybody, that's all we have time for today. Let's give one more big round of applause for Richard Garfield. Brought us all here today. Richard, thank you so much for letting me sit here with you for this hour. It's been a great honor.
It's been a lot of fun talking. Thank you.